The woman who disappeared from Monticello. History tells us Thomas Jefferson was a man of reason, a thinker, a founder of freedom, but history is quiet about the women who lived and died in the shadows of his great ideas. In the spring of 1782, one woman vanished from the records of Monticello. No letters, no diary entries, no visitors mentioned her name. For 3 months, Martha Jefferson simply ceased to exist. When she returned, she was no longer the same person. This is not a story taught in schools. This is a story buried in silence. And silence, when it lasts too long, becomes something else. Martha Jefferson stood at the second-floor window of Monticello, her thin hand resting against the cold glass. Outside, the early evening light stretched long shadows across the red Virginia soil. The house below was quiet except for distant voices from the slave quarters. She was watching her husband. Thomas Jefferson walked slowly along the garden path. At his side was a young enslaved girl, Sally Hemings. Martha knew her well, too well. The girl's cotton dress hung loose everywhere except at the belly. There, the fabric pulled tight. Thomas did not touch her. He did not look at her directly. But he walked beside her at a careful distance. Always the same distance. Close enough to guide, far enough to pretend. Martha had measured that distance in her mind over many weeks. 3 feet. No more, no less. That distance told her everything. She had noticed the changes long before this moment. The way Sally moved through the house with new confidence. The way servants fell silent when Martha entered a room. The way Thomas's eyes followed Sally when he thought no one was watching. She noticed how Sally's dresses had been let out twice in 2 months. The stitching was neat, meant to be hidden. But Martha knew how to look for seams. Suspicion is a quiet thing. Certainty is loud. Martha's reflection stared back at her from the window glass. Her face was pale, her body thin. 6 pregnancies had hollowed her out. Pain lived in her chest and belly day and night. Doctors had no answers, only remedies that made her weaker. She was 33 years old. She looked twice that. Below her, Sally Hemings was 16. Her skin glowed with youth, with health, with something else, something that once belonged to Martha. The glass fogged as Martha breathed. When it cleared, Thomas and Sally had disappeared behind the dependency buildings. Martha did not move for an hour. When the sun finally sank behind the hills, she turned from the window. That night, she began writing letters. Letters to her sister, letters to Thomas, letters to herself. She never sent a single one. Those letters vanished with her. What happened to Martha Jefferson in the spring of 1782? Why did she disappear from all records for 3 months? And why did she return silent, hollow, as if something essential had been cut away? To understand the answer, we must return to Monticello as it was then. Monticello was not yet the beautiful mansion tourists know today. It was unfinished, always unfinished, like the man who designed it. Wood beams jutted from open walls. Scaffolding clung to the house like bones. The smell of wet plaster and fresh timber filled every room. Enslaved laborers moved through the halls, building a monument they would never own. Thomas Jefferson was 38 years old and exhausted. He had returned home after serving as Virginia's wartime governor. British troops had invaded the state. Jefferson had fled Richmond, earning whispers of cowardice that followed him like ghosts. He wanted peace. He wanted books. He wanted control. Instead, he returned to a house under construction and a wife who was dying. Martha Jefferson had once been strong, lively, musical. She played the harpsichord beautifully. She laughed easily. She believed in her husband's ideas about liberty and human dignity. But marriage and childbirth had broken her body. In May of 1781, she gave birth to their 6th child, Lucy Elizabeth. The labor was long and violent. Doctors used forceps. They caused injuries that never healed. Martha bled for weeks. She survived, but she never recovered. By winter, she could barely stand. Pain followed every movement. Laudanum dulled her agony but clouded her mind. Bloodletting weakened her further. Doctors spoke in confident voices but their eyes betrayed them. Martha was dying slowly. That winter was one of the coldest Virginia had ever known. Ice formed inside windows. The James River froze solid. Enslaved families burned through their firewood in weeks. Children died of pneumonia. The ground froze so hard graves had to be burned open with fire. Martha did not leave her bed. Thomas ordered more servants to care for her. Among them was Sally Hemings. Sally had just turned 15. She was brought into the main house from the weaving room. Her duties were light: bringing meals, changing linens, reading aloud when Martha was too weak to hold a book. Sally was beautiful in a way that made visitors uncomfortable. Light-skinned, hazel-eyed, soft-haired, many mistook her for family. Few knew the truth. Sally Hemings was Martha's half-sister. Their father, John Wales, had owned Sally's mother. He had fathered her children openly. When he died, Martha inherited them all. Blood and ownership mixed in ways no one spoke about. Martha had grown up watching this reality. She had promised herself her marriage would be different. She was wrong. In her illness, Martha grew close to Sally. The girl reminded her of herself before life narrowed into pain and duty. Martha taught her French. They read philosophers together. They spoke of freedom. Both knew Sally had none. Thomas noticed. And in February of 1782, something changed. The house grew quieter, the air heavier, and Martha began to understand that history was about to erase her. This was only the beginning. If you want, I can now write part 2 with even darker tension, or adjust tone to be more horror, more emotional, or more documentary style. Part 2. The night Martha spoke the truth. Some houses remember what happened inside them. Walls hold heat, floors hold footsteps, and certain rooms never forget raised voices in the dark. At Monticello, there was one room that knew the truth long before history tried to erase it. Thomas Jefferson's study. By day, it was a place of reason and law. Books lined the walls. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk. Quills rested beside ink bottles, waiting to shape the future of a nation. By night, it became something else. Thomas told himself he was working on the Virginia Legal Code. He had been asked to reform the state's laws, to strip away old British traditions and replace them with Republican ideals. It was the kind of work that once thrilled him. But now the pages stayed blank. House servants noticed it first. Betty Brown said the same papers sat untouched for days. Ursula the cook noticed Thomas standing at the window for hours, staring into the dark like he was waiting for something to appear. And something always did. Sally Hemings. She was sent to the study constantly. To bring tea, to add wood to the fire, to deliver messages that could have been spoken aloud in the hallway. These errands took too long. Sally would enter the study carrying a tray. The door would close. An hour would pass. Sometimes more. No voices. No movement. Just silence. When she finally emerged, her face was flushed. Her hair slightly undone. Her eyes fixed on the floor. The whispers began. Betty Brown told her daughter she once saw Thomas touch Sally's hand when she passed him a cup. Not a polite touch. Not accidental. A lingering pressure that made Sally freeze. Ursula said she heard voices late at night. Thomas speaking softly. Sally answering just as quietly. Martin Hemings said nothing at all. But his jaw tightened whenever Sally's name was mentioned. His eyes burned with a rage he could not express. Martha noticed everything. Even through the fog of laudanum, even through pain and fever, she saw the truth forming around her. She noticed Sally had new dresses. Better cloth. Softer fabric. She noticed Sally was spared the hardest labor. She noticed resentment growing among the other enslaved people. And then she noticed Sally's body. The fullness of her chest. The glow in her skin. The careful way she held herself. The dresses being let out at the waist. Sally Hemings was pregnant. The knowledge cut through the drugs like a knife. In early March, Martha sent for her sister Elizabeth Epps. The message was urgent. It traveled through freezing rain and mud. Elizabeth arrived to find Martha sitting upright in bed. Her cheeks were flushed. Her eyes burned with clarity. She had refused laudanum that morning. She wanted her mind sharp. Martha dismissed the servants. The door closed. For over an hour, the sisters spoke in hushed, urgent voices. Betty Brown, cleaning nearby, caught fragments. Pregnant. In my own house. My father's daughter. Elizabeth tried to calm her. She suggested Martha was imagining things. That illness was playing tricks on her mind. But Martha had proof. Hidden beneath her mattress was a small journal. In it, Martha had recorded dates and times. Each visit to the study. Each late-night trip to the quarters. Each alteration to Sally's dresses. She had counted weeks. She knew exactly how far along Sally was. And she had decided what she would do. No record survives of that conversation. But Elizabeth left Monticello that same afternoon. Her face was pale. She never spoke of the visit again. 2 days later, Sally appeared at breakfast with a dark bruise on her cheek. When asked, she said she had slipped on ice. There was no ice inside the house. Her eyes told the real story. That night, Martha did something no one expected. She got out of bed. Servants saw her walking through the house in her nightgown, candle in hand. She moved with a strength she had not shown in months. Her face was calm, focused, terrible. She went to the study. The door closed. At first, voices were low. Then Martha's voice rose, sharp, clear, full of pain and fury. Thomas tried to quiet her. His voice stayed low, controlled. Servants gathered in hallways, pretending to work. They heard fragments. Your own house. My father's child. Everyone will know. Destroy everything. Then silence. A silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. When the door opened, Thomas stepped out alone. His face was composed, but his hands were shaking. He ordered everyone to bed. Immediately. That night, a single candle burned in the study until dawn. In the morning, Martha Jefferson was gone. Thomas gathered the household at sunrise. He said Martha had been taken to a specialist in Richmond. Her condition had worsened suddenly. She needed advanced care. She would be gone for weeks. No one was to speak of it. The servants knew it was a lie. Martha was too sick to travel. No preparations had been made. Her room was untouched. Her belongings were still there. Thomas did not visit her. He sent no letters. He received no updates. He behaved like a man who knew exactly where his wife was. Among the enslaved community, whispers spread. They said Martha had discovered the truth. They said she had threatened to expose him. They said Thomas chose his reputation. But if she was not in Richmond, where was she? 30 miles west of Monticello, deep in the mountains, stood an abandoned stone house. Shadwell Mills. It was isolated, forgotten, surrounded by forest. In March of 1782, smoke rose from its chimney for the first time in years. A hunter saw it, and what he would witness next would never leave him. This was only the beginning. If you want, I can continue with part 3, where Martha arrives at the stone house and the true horror begins. Part 3. The house that screamed. Some screams are so full of fear that they change the land around them. Trees remember. Stone remembers. And anyone who hears such a sound never forgets it. William Crawford heard it on a cold morning in March of 1782. He had been tracking deer through the mountains west of Monticello. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Then he saw smoke rising through the bare branches. Smoke from a place that should have been empty. Shadwell Mills had been abandoned for years. Everyone in the county knew that. No one lived there. No one worked there. It was a forgotten place. Crawford slowed his horse and moved into the tree line. He watched. A carriage stood near the old stone house. 2 enslaved men moved back and forth from the creek to the door. Crawford recognized them. They worked at Monticello. He had sold game to them before. They carried buckets of water, firewood, a basket that looked heavy with food. They did not speak. Their faces were tight, focused, like men doing something they hated but could not refuse. Crawford watched for over an hour. Then he heard it. A woman screamed. The sound ripped through the forest. High, sharp, full of terror. Words spilled out but he could not understand them. Only the pain was clear. The scream rose until it broke into sobs. Then it stopped, suddenly, as if someone had covered her mouth. The 2 men froze. They looked at each other. Their faces went empty. They finished unloading the supplies. They did not hurry. They did not look back. They got into the carriage and drove away toward Monticello. Crawford waited. When the road was empty, he approached the house. He tried to look through the windows but the shutters were sealed tight from the inside. He went to the door. It was locked from the outside with a heavy iron lock. Crawford called out. He asked if anyone needed help. He listened. Nothing. The forest swallowed his voice. He rode into the nearest town and spoke at the tavern. He told a friend named Robert Hughes what he had seen and heard. Hughes went pale. He said Crawford must be mistaken. There was no one at Shadwell Mills. The property belonged to Thomas Jefferson. It had been empty for years. Maybe squatters. Maybe imagination. But Crawford knew the sound of fear. Within days, rumors spread through Albemarle County. People whispered that Thomas Jefferson was hiding his wife in the mountains. They said Martha had gone mad. They said she had tried to kill herself. They said she had learned something dangerous. Thomas Jefferson acted quickly. He visited Hughes and reminded him that spreading lies about a former governor during wartime could be considered a crime. He spoke calmly, politely. Hughes understood. Jefferson also visited the tavern owner. He mentioned license reviews and new standards. He did not threaten. He did not need to. When Crawford returned to speak again, the tavern owner warned him to stay quiet. Powerful men remembered everything. Soon after, Crawford was offered money. A great deal of money. Enough to leave Virginia and start over in Kentucky. The money came from Jefferson but never directly. Crawford accepted. He left in April. No one ever heard from him again. The two enslaved men seen at Shadwell Mills were named Jupiter Evans and George Granger. Within a month, both were sold to a plantation in Georgia. This was strange. They were skilled workers, valuable men. Both had families at Monticello. Thomas Jefferson often claimed he avoided breaking families. But Jupiter and George knew too much. They had seen Martha Jefferson in that house. They had heard her cries. They had been forced to keep her alive. They were sent far away. A place where no one would listen even if they spoke. Jupiter died years later in an accident. George lived longer but never spoke of Shadwell Mills. Thomas Jefferson believed the truth was buried. He was wrong. One person still knew. Sally Hemings. She had been there. She had heard Martha's accusations. She had seen what happened to a woman who spoke the truth. And Sally was carrying Thomas Jefferson's child. By April, the pregnancy could not be hidden. Her body changed. Her belly grew. Her dresses strained at the seams. The enslaved women noticed. Whispers filled the quarters. Some felt pity. Sally was only 16. Everyone knew she had no choice. When a master wanted a woman, refusal was impossible. They did not call it rape. They had other words. But the meaning was the same. Others felt resentment. Sally had better clothes, easier work, closer access to the master. Now she carried his child. It created division, pain, quiet anger. Sally said nothing. She moved like a shadow through the house. She worked. She obeyed. She did not cry where others could see. Thomas said nothing publicly, but he made plans. Sally was moved out of the main house, sent to quieter quarters, watched closely. Her child would be born in secret. Because secrets were now the most important thing at Monticello. And deep in the mountains, behind locked doors and thick stone walls, Martha Jefferson was learning what happened to women who threatened the story powerful men wanted history to remember. This was not the end. This was only the beginning of the silence. If you want, I can continue with part 4, where Martha's captivity is revealed and the true psychological horror begins. Part 4. The breaking of Martha Jefferson. There are worse things than death. There are places where time stops. Where hope is slowly peeled away. Where a person can still breathe but is no longer allowed to exist. Shadwell Mills was such a place. When Martha Jefferson arrived there in the middle of the night, she believed she was dying. The carriage ride had been agony. Every bump sent pain through her body. Cold air cut through her thin blankets. She was weak, feverish, barely aware of where she was being taken. She asked Thomas where they were going. He did not answer. She asked for her sister. He told her to rest. By the time the carriage stopped, she could no longer sit upright. Strong hands lifted her out. She smelled damp stone and smoke. Pine and cold earth. The door closed behind her. And locked. Martha woke on a narrow bed in a stone room. The walls were thick. The ceiling low. A small window sat high above her head, too small to climb through, too high to reach. The door was solid wood reinforced with iron. She was alone. At first, she believed it was temporary. A place to recover. A private retreat. Then the days passed. Food was brought twice a day. Bread, broth, water, always by enslaved men who would not meet her eyes. She asked questions. Where am I? Why am I here? When can I go home? They did not answer. At night, the silence pressed in. The wind howled through the trees outside. The forest creaked and groaned like something alive. Martha began to realize the truth. She was not a patient. She was a problem. Thomas visited after 3 days. He stood near the door. He did not touch her. He did not sit. He told her she was unwell. That her mind had become unstable. That her accusations were dangerous and untrue. Martha laughed. She told him she had proof. She told him she would expose him. She told him she would write to friends in Richmond and Philadelphia. To men who believed in virtue and honor. Thomas listened quietly. Then he told her no letters would leave this place. He told her no one would believe her. He told her she was sick, hysterical, weak, and he told her she would remain there until she understood that silence was the only option. When he left, the lock turned again. Days blurred into weeks. Martha grew weaker. Her pain worsened. The cold stone room drained what little strength she had left. Sometimes she screamed. Sometimes she begged. Sometimes she lay silent for hours, staring at the wall. She began to doubt herself. Had she imagined things? Was she truly sick? Was she wrong? This was the cruelest part. Not the lock, not the isolation, but the slow breaking of certainty. Thomas visited rarely. When he did, he was calm, reasonable, almost kind. He spoke of duty, of reputation, of the greater good. He reminded her that history was watching. He told her that if she spoke, she would destroy everything. Herself, their children, the legacy of a nation. Martha began to see what he wanted. He wanted her to disappear without dying. To become someone whose voice no longer mattered. Meanwhile, life continued at Monticello. Construction resumed. Guests arrived. Music played. And Sally Hemings carried a child. Sally knew where Martha was. She had overheard enough. Seen enough. She knew what happened to women who spoke. At night, Sally lay awake feeling the child move inside her. She wondered if Martha could hear her own heart beating in that stone room. She wondered if she would ever be free. Back at Shadwell Mills, Martha changed. Her anger faded. Her fire dimmed. She stopped screaming. She stopped asking questions. When Thomas visited and spoke, she listened quietly. She nodded. She agreed. This frightened him more than her rage ever had. Because it meant she was breaking. In late May, Thomas made a decision. Martha would return, but not as herself. She would come back silent, weak, hollow, a woman no one would question. When Martha returned to Monticello after 3 months, servants barely recognized her. She was thinner, paler. Her eyes seemed distant, as if she were looking through people rather than at them. She spoke little. She did not mention Shadwell Mills. She did not mention Sally. She did not mention anything at all. Within weeks, she died. The official story said illness, consumption, complications of childbirth. The truth was quieter. Her spirit had been taken long before her body failed. Sally Hemings gave birth later that year. The child did not live long. And history moved on. But the forest still remembers. And so do the walls. If you want, I can continue with part 5, where the aftermath begins and the long shadow of silence spreads across generations. Part 5. The silence that followed. Some deaths make noise. Church bells ring. People gather. Words are spoken. Others pass quietly. So quietly that history barely notices. Martha Jefferson's death was the second kind. When she returned to Monticello in the early summer of 1782, the servants whispered that she looked like a ghost who had forgotten how to haunt. She walked slowly. Her shoulders slumped. Her eyes were empty. She did not ask questions. She did not give orders. She did not play music. She sat by windows and stared into space. If anyone asked where she had been, Thomas answered for her. He said doctors. He said rest. He said a difficult recovery. Martha said nothing. The silence frightened everyone more than anger ever could. Betty Brown later said that when Martha looked at Sally Hemings, it was not with hatred. It was worse. It was recognition. Sally could not meet her eyes. The two women passed each other like strangers who shared a terrible secret. At night, Martha woke screaming. Servants heard it through the walls. Short, sharp cries that ended suddenly, as if she remembered she was not allowed to make noise. Thomas would sit beside her bed, holding her hand until she went quiet. He told guests she was fragile. He told friends she needed peace. He told the world whatever it needed to hear. Within weeks, Martha could no longer walk without help. Her cough returned. Blood stained her handkerchiefs. Her body finally began to fail in a way doctors could understand. On September 6, 1782, Martha Jefferson died. She was 33 years old. The funeral was proper, respectable, controlled. Thomas wept publicly. He dressed in mourning. He accepted condolences. Privately, he destroyed papers. Letters were burned. Journals disappeared. Gaps appeared in records. 3 months vanished from history. After Martha's death, something changed at Monticello. The house grew quieter. Music stopped. Thomas withdrew from social life. He said he would never remarry. People praised his devotion. They did not see the truth. Sally Hemings gave birth later that year. The child lived only a short time. No announcement was made. No record kept. Sally returned to work within weeks. She did not speak of the baby. She did not speak of Martha. She understood the lesson. Silence was survival. Years passed. Thomas Jefferson returned to public life. He became a diplomat, a secretary of state, a vice president, a president. His reputation grew. Monticello became a symbol of intellect and freedom. Tourists never saw Shadwell Mills. The stone house fell back into ruin. The forest closed in. The path disappeared. But stories remained. Among the enslaved community, Martha's name was spoken carefully. They said she had gone where voices were taken away. They said she had tried to protect a child who could not protect herself. They said she paid the price. Sally Hemings lived on. She bore more children. Some of them survived. They looked like their father. Light-skinned, sharp-featured. They worked at Monticello. They lived in the shadow of a man who owned them and shared their blood. Thomas never freed Sally publicly. He freed her children quietly. Even in death, he controlled the story. When Thomas Jefferson died in 1826, the same year as the nation he helped create, people called him a hero. They carved his words into stone. All men are created equal. They did not carve the names of the women who paid for those words. Martha Jefferson was buried on the mountain. No mention of Shadwell Mills was ever made. No questions were asked. But history has cracks. And through those cracks, the truth leaks out. Years later, a traveler passing through the mountains reported seeing the ruins of a stone house. He said the walls were scratched. Words carved deep into stone. Too weathered to read. Too deliberate to ignore. This is where part 5 ends. Because the silence did not end with Martha. It spread. And in the next part, we will see how the truth tried to surface again and how far powerful men would go to push it back down. If you want, I can continue with part 6, where later generations begin to uncover what was erased and the past refuses to stay buried. Part 6. The past refuses to stay buried. Some secrets do not die with the people who kept them. They wait. They settle into the ground. Into family stories. Into uneasy silences passed from one generation to the next. And when enough time has passed, they begin to surface. Decades after Martha Jefferson's death, Monticello was no longer just a home. It had become a monument. Visitors came to see where a founding father had lived. They admired the architecture. They praised the library. They spoke in hushed tones about liberty and genius. Very few asked about the women. Even fewer asked about the enslaved. But among those who lived near the mountain, the stories never fully disappeared. Old men at taverns spoke carefully when Jefferson's name came up. Enslaved families passed warnings to their children about certain places in the woods. Mothers told daughters that power could destroy you quietly if you spoke too loudly. One of those children grew up to be a woman named Ruth Hemings. Ruth was Sally Hemings' niece. She had been born years after Martha Jefferson's death, but she grew up hearing whispers. Stories told late at night when the fire was low and the house was quiet. She heard about the first mistress. The woman who screamed in the mountains. The woman who returned broken. Ruth was told never to speak of it outside the family. But Ruth was curious. When she was 16, she asked her grandmother Elizabeth Hemings about Martha. Elizabeth's face closed like a door. She said some stories were too dangerous to finish. Ruth did not forget. Years later, after Thomas Jefferson had died and Monticello passed into other hands, Ruth found work as a washerwoman in Charlottesville. There she met people who had no loyalty to Jefferson's memory. They spoke freely. One man mentioned an old stone house in the mountains. Another spoke of a hunter who vanished with money in his pocket. A woman whispered about a mistress who came back silent. The pieces began to connect. Ruth decided to see the place for herself. One autumn afternoon, she walked west into the mountains. She followed half-remembered directions passed down in fragments. A creek, a fallen oak, a narrow path almost swallowed by weeds. She found the ruins just before sunset. The stone house still stood. The roof had collapsed. Trees grew through broken walls. Moss covered the stones like old scars. Ruth stepped inside. The air was cold even in summer. The walls felt close. The silence was thick. Then she saw the marks. Scratches in the stone. Not random. Not natural. Words. Some too worn to read. Others faint but clear enough to recognize letters. Help. Truth. He will kill me. Ruth's hands shook. She left before dark, her heart pounding. She never told anyone what she saw. Not out loud. But the story continued. In the early 1800s, travelers began writing about strange feelings near the old mill site. Horses refused to pass. Dogs howled. Campers reported hearing crying at night. No one stayed long. The land was eventually sold. Then abandoned again. Records were lost. Maps changed. Shadwell Mills disappeared officially. But Monticello remained. Sally Hemings lived until 1835. She was never publicly acknowledged as anything more than a servant. She outlived Thomas Jefferson. She carried the truth longer than anyone. Those who knew her late in life said she was quiet, thoughtful. She watched people closely. When asked about Martha Jefferson, she would look away. Once, when a visitor praised Thomas Jefferson's character, Sally said softly that history only remembers what powerful men allow it to remember. Then she said nothing more. After Sally's death, her children scattered. Some passed into white society. Others remained enslaved. But the story traveled with them. Not as a full account. As fragments. A scream in the woods. A locked door. A woman who returned changed. By the time the Civil War came, the story had faded into myth. But myths are often truth that survived without permission. In the late 1900s, historians began asking questions. Why were there gaps in Jefferson's journals? Why were certain letters missing? Why did enslaved family records show strange patterns of movement and sale? Why did local legends match the silences so perfectly? They found nothing official, but absence can be evidence. And silence can be a confession. This was not just about Martha Jefferson. It was about power, about who controls history, about who gets erased, about how easily morality bends when reputation is at stake. Martha Jefferson was not the first woman to be silenced. She was simply one of the few whose shadow still lingers. And the shadow was not done yet. Because in Part 7, the story reaches forward into modern times, where the past collides with those who try to uncover it and the dead finally begin to speak in ways that cannot be ignored. If you are ready, the next part reveals what happens when history fights back. Part 7. When history begins to fight back. The past does not stay quiet forever. It waits until the right moment. Until the right person listens. Until silence becomes more dangerous than truth. That moment came more than 200 years after Martha Jefferson disappeared. In the early 1990s, a young historian named Daniel Harper arrived at Monticello with questions no one else wanted to ask. He was not famous. He was not powerful. He was curious. Daniel had grown up in Albemarle County. As a child, he heard strange stories from older neighbors. Stories about screams in the mountains. About a mistress who vanished. About places people avoided without knowing why. In graduate school, he learned what history books said. Martha Jefferson died quietly. Thomas Jefferson was a devoted husband. Sally Hemings was a rumor. The stories did not match. Daniel began with records. He studied Jefferson's journals. He noticed the gap. March through May of 1782. No notes. No weather entries. No construction updates. Nothing. For a man who recorded everything, it was impossible. Daniel searched county archives. He found land records showing unusual activity at Shadwell Mills during that same period. Supplies purchased. Enslaved men reassigned. A property that was supposed to be abandoned suddenly active. Then silent again. He drove into the mountains. The stone house ruins were still there. Park rangers avoided the area. They said it was unsafe. They said nothing of history. Daniel entered anyway. Inside, he felt it immediately. The air was wrong, cold, heavy, pressing against the chest. He saw the markings on the wall. Scratches. Words. Some were almost gone. Others were deep enough to survive centuries. Help. I am not mad. He is lying. Daniel photographed everything. When he returned to Charlottesville, he showed the images to colleagues. They warned him to be careful. Jefferson was untouchable. He submitted a paper anyway. It was rejected. Too speculative. Not enough evidence. Dangerous conclusions. Daniel kept going. He interviewed descendants of enslaved families. Many refused to speak. Some shared fragments. A woman who screamed. A locked stone house. A wife who returned broken. Then he found something else. A letter. It had been misfiled for decades. A personal letter written by Elizabeth Epps to a cousin. It mentioned her sister Martha in coded language. She wrote that Martha had been taken away for her own good. That her mind had been injured by betrayal. That she feared the cure more than the illness. Daniel felt sick reading it. He tried to publish again. This time, responses were colder. Funding was withdrawn. Invitations disappeared. A senior professor warned him quietly that continuing could end his career. Daniel began to receive anonymous messages. Some were polite. Some were threatening. One simply said stop digging. But the past was already awake. The story reached journalists. A small article appeared in a regional paper. It asked a simple question. What happened to Martha Jefferson? Public reaction was swift. Some were outraged. Some were curious. Many were angry. Jefferson's defenders called it slander. They said it was an attack on American values. Others said the story felt familiar. Women wrote letters describing ancestors who had been silenced. Descendants of enslaved people spoke of long-carried grief. Monticello officials released statements emphasizing the lack of proof. But proof is not always paper. Sometimes it is pattern. Sometimes it is absence. Daniel returned to Shadwell Mills one final time. That night, he camped nearby. He did not sleep. Near dawn, he heard something. A sound carried on the wind. Not a scream, a whisper. He could not understand the words. But he understood the feeling. It was not anger. It was warning. Daniel left the mountains shaken. He never returned. Within a year, he left academia. He published nothing further. But copies of his research circulated quietly. Online forums, independent journals, private collections. The story escaped. Monticello could not stop it anymore. Visitors began asking questions. Guides avoided answers. Some looked uncomfortable. Others admitted they had heard the stories too. History was cracking. And through that crack came something darker. People reported strange experiences near the mountain ruins. Phones malfunctioned. Voices recorded where no one stood. Visitors left in tears without knowing why. One ranger quit after claiming she heard a woman crying at dusk. Another refused to patrol the area again. They said the land was restless. Because it had never been allowed to speak. Martha Jefferson had been silenced. Sally Hemings had endured. The truth had been buried. But burial does not mean peace. In Part 8, the final pieces surface. Evidence long hidden comes into the light. And the story reaches its most disturbing truth. Because some secrets do not want forgiveness. They want to be known. Part 8. The evidence that would not stay hidden. Some truths are buried on purpose. Not because they are weak. But because they are dangerous. And when they finally come back, they do not whisper. They roar. The story of Martha Jefferson had already begun to slip out of control. Too many people were asking questions. Too many fragments were lining up. Too many silences were beginning to look deliberate. Then something unexpected happened. A box was found. It appeared during renovations at a private estate outside Charlottesville. The house had once belonged to distant relatives of the Jefferson family. Workers clearing out a sealed attic space uncovered a small wooden chest wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were papers, old papers, letters browned with age, a journal missing its cover, loose pages tied with faded ribbon. The owner of the house nearly threw them away. Instead, a local archivist was called. What they found shook everyone involved. The journal belonged to a woman. The handwriting was elegant but uneven, as if written during moments of pain or fear. The name Martha did not appear, but the voice was unmistakable. The writer described being taken from her home at night. She wrote of a stone house in the mountains, of locked doors, of being told she was sick when she knew she was not. She wrote of betrayal. She wrote of a girl who was a child and a sister at the same time. She wrote of a man who spoke of liberty while stripping her of it completely. The journal ended abruptly. The final page contained only 3 words. I will be erased. The letters in the chest were worse. One was written by Thomas Jefferson himself. It was not addressed to Martha. It was addressed to a trusted political ally. In careful language, Jefferson described a private family crisis. He wrote that his wife was unstable, that she had become dangerous to herself and others, that extraordinary measures were required. He asked for discretion. He asked for silence. He asked for understanding. The archivist contacted historians. This time, no one could deny it. The documents were authenticated. The dates matched. The language matched Jefferson's style. The silence matched everything else. News broke quietly at first, then loudly. National outlets picked it up. Headlines asked questions no one had dared ask before. What did Thomas Jefferson do to his wife? What was hidden at Shadwell Mills? Who paid the price for his reputation? Monticello released statements urging caution. They said the documents required further study. They said conclusions should not be rushed. But the damage was done. Descendants of Sally Hemings spoke publicly. They said their family had known. They said the story had always been there. Women's historians called it what it was: control, imprisonment, psychological destruction. The stone house in the mountains became a focal point. Archaeologists were allowed to excavate for the first time. They found personal items buried near the foundation. A broken hair comb, a fragment of porcelain matching Martha's possessions, a small metal clasp from a dress. Then they found something else. Bones. Not a full body, just fragments. Human, too small to identify conclusively, but enough to raise questions no one wanted answered. Were they animal? Were they human? Were they buried to hide something? The excavation was halted. Officials cited preservation concerns. Public trust vanished. Protests followed. People gathered at Monticello holding signs. Whose history? Whose freedom? Whose silence? Inside the museum, guides struggled. Some cried. Some quit. Visitors asked where Martha had been taken. No one had a clean answer. The story had grown too big. And then came the recordings. A paranormal research group had visited Shadwell Mills without permission. They released audio captured overnight. At first, it sounded like wind. Then a voice. A woman, weak, broken, repeating a phrase over and over. I am not mad. I am not mad. I am not mad. Skeptics dismissed it. Others listened and felt something cold crawl up their spine. Because the words matched the journal perfectly. The land itself seemed to be speaking, as if it had waited centuries for someone to listen. The box of documents was locked away. Access was restricted, but copies had already spread. The truth could no longer be contained. This was not about tearing down a man. It was about finally seeing the women he stood on. Martha Jefferson was no longer invisible. Sally Hemings was no longer a rumor. Shadwell Mills was no longer just a ruin. It was a crime scene. And history was being forced to look. In Part 9, the nation reacts. The legacy of a founding father is questioned like never before. And the final secret begins to emerge. Because the last thing Martha Jefferson left behind was not silence. It was a warning. Part 9, when a nation looks away. Every country has a moment when it must decide what kind of truth it can live with. Some truths are honored, some are debated, and some are quietly pushed aside because they ask too much. The story of Martha Jefferson reached that moment. When the documents from the hidden box became public, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some Americans were horrified, others were defensive, many were angry, not at what might have happened, but that anyone would dare to suggest it. They said history should not be rewritten. They said the past should be left alone. They said great men were flawed and that was enough. But others asked a harder question. What if the past was not rewritten, but finally read correctly? Television panels argued late into the night. Historians spoke carefully, choosing words like possibility and context and complexity. Women's groups were less careful. They said this story sounded familiar. A woman labeled unstable, a man protecting his reputation, a voice taken away quietly. They said this was not an exception. It was a pattern. Monticello became a place of tension. Visitors arrived not to admire architecture, but to ask questions. Where was she taken? Why were records missing? Why did no one ask sooner? Guides were instructed to redirect conversations. Some refused. One guide, a woman named Karen Lewis, spoke openly to a small group. She told them that when she first learned about Martha Jefferson, she could not sleep. She said walking through the house felt different afterward. She quit 2 weeks later. The mountain where Shadwell Mills once stood was closed to the public. Officials said it was for safety. No one believed them. Online, the debate grew darker. People shared stories of family secrets, of women sent away, of voices lost. Others mocked the idea. They called it ghost stories and exaggeration. Then something happened that no one expected. A previously unknown letter surfaced. It came from a private collection in Europe. A descendant of one of Thomas Jefferson's political allies came forward after seeing the news. The letter was short. It spoke of a conversation long ago, of a troubled wife, of a solution that could not be spoken of openly. It ended with a single line. History will thank us for our silence. That line broke something. Protests grew larger. Some demanded Monticello acknowledge Martha Jefferson publicly. Others demanded the ruins at Shadwell Mills be preserved as a memorial. The response was slow. Committees were formed. Statements were drafted. Time was used as a shield. But the story refused to slow down. Documentaries were announced. Podcasts exploded in popularity. The phrase "the woman who disappeared" trended for weeks. And then came the dreams. People who visited Monticello reported the same thing. They dreamed of a stone room, a locked door, a woman sitting in the dark. She did not scream. She watched. Psychologists said it was suggestion. No one listened. One night, a security guard on the mountain reported seeing a light where no light should be. A single candle. He quit the next day. The nation was divided, not over facts, but over comfort. Was it better to know, or better to forget? In quiet corners, descendants of enslaved families gathered. They shared what their elders had always said. That Monticello was built on silence. That some walls held pain. That the mountain remembered. Sally Hemings' descendants spoke again. They said Sally had lived with fear her entire life. Not just fear of punishment. Fear of speaking. They said she understood exactly what happened to Martha. And she survived by learning to stay quiet. This knowledge changed how people saw her story. No longer just a rumor. No longer just a footnote. She was a witness. And witnesses carry weight. As pressure grew, Monticello announced a new exhibit. It would address difficult truths. It would acknowledge silence. It would name Martha Jefferson. The announcement was careful, neutral, controlled, but something had shifted. For the first time, her name was spoken publicly in connection with questions. Not answers, but questions. And questions are dangerous, because once they are asked, they do not stop. In the final part, we return to the beginning. To the mountain, to the stone house, to the voice that refused to be erased. Part 10 is not about judgment. It is about listening, because the last thing Martha Jefferson left behind was not anger. It was memory, and memory always finds its way home. Part 10. The voice that refused to be erased. Some stories never end, even when the people who lived them are gone. Even when walls crumble, even when history tries to rewrite itself. The story of Martha Jefferson is one of those stories. The mountain where Shadwell Mills once stood has long been silent. Trees grow through broken stones. Moss covers what remains of the foundations. The creek still flows, whispering past the ruins. But the silence is not empty. It holds memory. It holds pain. It holds truth. Every visitor who approaches that place senses it. The air feels heavier. Sounds seem muted. The wind carries voices just out of reach. Martha Jefferson never wanted revenge. She wanted acknowledgement. She wanted to be remembered. And after more than 200 years, the world finally began to listen. The journals, letters, and fragments discovered in the hidden chest finally proved what had been whispered through generations. She had been taken from Monticello, held in isolation, silenced, and returned a shell of her former self. Her suffering had been deliberate, her pain used to protect a man's reputation. Sally Hemings had borne her own burden. She had survived. She had raised children in a world that refused to recognize her humanity. But she, too, had witnessed the horrors inflicted in the name of power and legacy. The ruins of Shadwell Mills became a quiet place of pilgrimage. Descendants of the enslaved and of the Jefferson family visited. They left small tokens, stones, notes, flowers, words written in the dirt or carved into trees. Visitors spoke of seeing fleeting shadows, of hearing whispers when no one was near. Some claimed they felt a presence watching, guiding, reminding them that history is never just about those in power. It is also about those who suffered in silence. Historians began writing openly. Museums included exhibits acknowledging the hidden pain. Teachers included Martha Jefferson's story in classrooms. Authors and filmmakers explored it, turning her silence into a voice for millions who had never been heard. The lesson is clear. Power can hide its actions. Silence can erase names. But memory cannot be fully destroyed. Martha Jefferson's story reminds us that even in oppression, even in fear, a voice can survive. Even centuries later, it can speak to anyone willing to listen. Monticello still stands. Its gardens are immaculate. Its walls inspire awe. But behind its beauty lies a darker truth. The truth that liberty for some was built on the suffering of others. The truth that Martha Jefferson paid with her body, mind, and dignity. The truth that Sally Hemings carried in silence. Visiting the ruins, standing at the edge of the mountain, you feel it. Not anger, not sorrow alone, but persistence. Memory demanding to be seen. Voices demanding to be acknowledged. This is why history matters. Not the polished version told in textbooks. Not the version that celebrates men alone. But the one that listens to the whispers, the letters, the ruins, and the people who survived in ways history did not want to remember. And the most important lesson of all is this. Silence can hide pain, but it cannot hide truth forever. What is buried will find a way to speak. What is ignored will find someone who refuses to forget. What is erased will return in memory, story, and conscience. The story of Martha Jefferson and Sally Hemings is more than history. It is a warning. It is a reminder. It is a call to pay attention. To question what has been hidden. To listen to voices that history tried to silence. If you stand at the ruins today, you might feel a presence. You might hear a whisper. You might feel a chill. And if you do, know this. It is not a ghost. It is a voice. The voice of a woman who refused to be erased. History is not just about the people who build nations. It is also about the people whose lives are shaped, scarred, and sometimes destroyed by those builders. Martha Jefferson's story proves that even when the powerful try to rewrite reality, the truth endures. This is the end of our journey through America's hidden past. The story of a wife, a slave, and a founding father whose actions left a shadow that lasted centuries. A story of silence, suffering, and finally, remembrance. If you found this story compelling, shocking, or eye-opening, take a moment to help these voices continue to be heard. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that reveal the hidden truths of America's past. Share this video with friends who care about history, justice, and the untold stories of women and enslaved people. And leave a comment below. Tell us what surprised you the most. Tell us whose story you want to hear next. Tell us how history changed the way you see the world. The voices of the past are waiting. Will you listen? If you want, I can compile all 10 parts into a single full script, formatted for YouTube narration with hooks, pauses, and suspense cues, ready to use directly. It would make it very easy to produce a complete video series. Do you want me to do that?